I'm here with Elliott West, Alumni Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Arkansas, and author of Continental Reckoning, The American West in the Age of Expansion. So, Professor West, I'm going to start with a few questions here about what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I have had a long-standing love affair with the history of the American West, all of it in particular. But the part of Western history that has fascinated me most is this period in the middle, roughly the middle of the 19th century, at the time of we might call the birth of what we call today the American West. It was this extraordinary period. It began with the expansion of the 1840s. In 1845 and 1848, this country added about 1,200,000 square miles to its territory in 3 years. 1845, we acquired Texas. 1846, the next year, we settle up with Great Britain and acquire the Pacific Northwest. Same year, we go to war with Mexico, a war that lasts 2 years. In 1848, we sign a treaty that gives us California and the Southwest and most of the Great Basin. So that comes up to about 750 million acres of land acquired in only 3 years. And this place, of course, was extraordinarily diverse, both geographically and in its human makeup. That's in 1848. Now you move forward just 30 years, roughly one generation, and this great splay of land and of human groups has come into a kind of coherence and has become one thing, what we call today the American West. During this period, that so many of the events and developments that we associate with that time took place, overland trails and mining rushes and Indian wars and railroad building and so forth. And it happened so fast, so quickly. And so when Richard Edeling, the editor of the History of American West series and University of Nebraska, asked me if I would like to write this book, summing all this up, bringing it all together, I said, sure, that sounds great. But then as I did it, I increasingly became convinced that this was really one of two stories during that period. It's during these same years, from the 1840s until about 1880, same roughly 30 years, that we see really the course of the United States, its historical course, shift onto a new trajectory toward what we would come to know as modern America, the nation that we would know in the 20th and now the 21st century. We moved in this new direction. And what I became increasingly convinced was that these two stories, that is the birth of the West, the birth of modern America, are not just simultaneous, they're also completely tangled together. You cannot understand one without the other. So what I've tried to do in Continental Reckoning in this book is to tell both of those stories together, to talk about the emergence of the American West as the region that we know, the emergence of the modern American nation that we know, have come to know in the last century and a quarter or so. That's what I'm trying to do in the book.
Great. And what kind of research was necessary while you were writing this book?
Well, I had to draw on the usual suspects. It's hundreds of government documents that covered everything from Indian policy to exploration to promotion of various things in the West. All kinds of materials from the various enterprises that were involved in creating the West and bringing it into the nation, from mining and ranching and agriculture and so forth. All of that material, oral histories of native peoples, trying to allow them to have their say about their side of this story. All of that, but also from the beginning of my own work in Western history. This is 50 years ago. From the beginning, I was fascinated by what we call social history, which I think of as sort of the history of everyday life, of everyday people, how people have muddled their way through their days the way that most of Americans do today. That history is in documents like diaries, letters, and reminiscences and memoirs. And from the beginning of my own work, I've tried to look into those records as much as I can. And what I've tried to do in this book is to allow those to draw on those records as well, to delve into the lives of ordinary folks as they go through this extraordinary time and experiences, to allow these ordinary voices to come out as much as possible, to allow them to have their say. You might say to try to give a kind of some bodiness to these very large stories that I'm trying to cover as well, to bring that all together, to give a sort of a sense of humanity to these larger themes that I'm working with.
Okay. And did you then lay the book out chronologically, or is it more of a thematic treatment of the West?
Well, both. It's necessarily both. If it's a story of the birth of the West, then it's necessarily chronological. These events happen, they lead to those events, and they lead to other events. It's a story. So sure, it's fundamentally chronological. I divide it roughly from the 1840s and the expansion of the 1840s up until the end of the Civil War around 1865. That section I call Unsettling America. The first effect of expansion was it nearly destroyed this nation. This nation nearly flew apart with the Civil War, which was triggered by expansion and the question of slavery in the West. And then from then on, after 1865, I tried to look at how the West was consolidated, how it was brought together, how it was integrated into the nation and to the larger world, and how all this was done through the development of Western resources and the transformation of the Western land and environment. So it's chronological in that sense, but it's also necessarily thematic. If it's also the story not just of the birth of the West, but of how this was part of the making of modern America, then you've got to deal with certain themes. The role of the federal government, for example, the introduction of technological revolutions and so forth, the economic development of the West and of the nation. So it's a little bit of a juggling act, trying to handle it, to tell the story chronologically, but also to introduce these themes and develop them as well as they go along. And hopefully, I didn't drop too many balls as I did.
Well, tell me a little bit more about the creation of the West and the emergence of modern America and how they're related today.
Oh boy, it's a big question and a complicated question. One way you might think of it is this way. You might begin by asking yourself, what is it? What are the characteristics of modern America that were different from the America that we knew before this great transformation, before this shift of its historical course? And then ask yourself, if these are the fundamental things that make modern America, that define modern America, how many of them, to what extent can we trace those changes back to the creation of the West, the birth of this region of the country? And I think once you do that, you can begin to see this connection. Some examples: modern America developed into the wealthiest and most powerful economy in the history of the world. We still are. No competition. There's no doubt about that. How does that happen? It happens in a lot of different ways, but certainly it has required the fundamental makings of this new economy. That is resources. And I think it's without question that the American West has been the great storehouse, a treasure house of natural resources for this country. From the very beginning, the first chapter in this book I call The Great Coincidence. It's really something. The last of these three steps of expansion was the war with Mexico that was ended by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that was signed on February the 2nd, 1848. On January the 24th, 1848, 9 days before that treaty was signed, a New Jersey carpenter named James Marshall discovered this first fleck of gold in the American River in Northern California. And this was the beginning of what was far and away the greatest outpouring of gold in human history until that time. More gold was produced in California in 1 year, 1852, than had been produced throughout the entire world in the 18th century. And in
Wow.
10 years after Marshall's discovery, the discovery of one of the history's greatest silver strikes in the Comstock Lode, just over the Sierra Nevada from Marshall's discovery. So you begin with the fact that expansion led immediately to the outpouring of wealth, of the fundamental stuff to pay for this economic transformation of the nation. And it just goes on from there. In industrialization, the making of a modern industrial state, the most important, the most vital, non-precious metal is copper. And it turned out that the West had, at the time, far and away the greatest copper deposits in history up until that time, in Montana and in Arizona and elsewhere. So the America is this great economic power. How did that happen? It happened in part because of what the West gave us. Modern America is the America we know today is one that increasingly has looked far westward into the Pacific world, into Asia, into the Far East. That begins with expansion. Obviously, we expand to the Pacific Ocean, but then immediately there's gold. Gold is discovered. The port of San Francisco becomes one of those vital and active ports on Earth at that time. A few years later, after the discovery of gold, Japan was opened up to Commodore Perry. So from then on, we become if you want to excuse a very bad pun, it's an orientation, a new orientation of the United States, looking westward, so far west that we're in the Far East. So much else. The United States, the modern America that we know, is one of great racial and ethnic diversity, and of great debates and arguments over just how wide open the American door should be to different ethnic and racial groups. We associate that, I think, most of all with emancipation, with the emancipation of more than 4 million enslaved African Americans after the American Civil War, and that obviously is a hugely important step in this. But that story begins before that. That story of sort of the widening embrace of the American family begins in the West. It begins with expansion, with the incorporation of former citizens of Mexico, with the embrace of dozens of native peoples in the far West. And with the gold rush, the sudden inflooding of all of these people from all over the world, some of them with ways of life that are dramatically different from ours. The most obvious example are the Chinese. And out of all of that, these arguments and these debates and violent response to these efforts to expand the American family begin in the West as well. The attempted genocide of California Indians, the violent marginalization of Hispanic peoples in California and in the Southwest. The rate of lynching, not the numbers, but the rate of lynching of Hispanos in Southern California and in the Southwest in the 1840s and 50s was greater than the rate of lynching of African Americans in the American Southeast in those dark years after Reconstruction from the 1880s on. So both the expansion of the American family and the violent resistance to it, all of which, of course, continues today, again, it's a truly continental story. It's a story that we have to look at as not just where we most associate it, it is in the American East and the Southeast, in the South, but in the American West as well. It's a story that unites us together in some ways, in terrible ways.
Well, you can't really discuss the West without talking about how we've treated indigenous peoples. What do we now know about what our ancestors dealt with and how they deemed the Indian problem.
Indian problem, right? uh, well, I think you have to begin with a couple of points. First, as you say, Purdy, you cannot possibly begin to understand the story of the birth of the West and of its role in national life without making the story of Native peoples, of American Indian peoples, absolutely crucial to it. It has to weave throughout that entire period. You have to bring the story of Indian peoples close to center stage if you're going to do that. The second large point to remember, I think, is that in the end, the bottom line of this is that for Indian peoples, the story is absolutely catastrophic, absolutely devastating. It's a story of at least attempted genocide in certain parts of the West, not everywhere in the West, in my opinion at least, but certainly places like California and parts of the Southwest, attempts to simply eradicate Indians. It's a story of everywhere throughout the West of dispossession, loss of homelands, the loss of land, loss of independence. It's a story of, now this is true throughout the West, a story of what we might call cultural genocide. The open effort, this is what you're talking about, the Indian problem, was called the Indian problem, was the attempt to destroy Native cultures in order to integrate them into this national family. These outright assaults by the federal government on Native life ways, on Native cultures, on Native languages, on Native religions, how Native peoples, how Indian peoples spoke to God. All of that was part of it as well. So the larger story is one of catastrophe. But 2 points, I think we need to make 2 other points to qualify that in certain ways. The first is that while the overall story is one of disaster, it's horrific, it's not a simple morality tale. It's not this melodrama. We could divide every character in it into either victims or villains. Much more complex than that. It's a historically rich story, as you would expect, because we're talking again about scores of different cultures and peoples. The second point is, and this I became increasingly aware of as I researched and wrote this book. The second point is that the bottom line is also one of Native survival and persistence and adaptation. It's an extraordinary story that's not as obvious as the other horrific aspects of it. But the attempt by the government, the attempt by our government, my people, to destroy these cultures has failed. They have survived, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of cultures and ways of life. And to me, that's one of the more fascinating and I think heartening aspects of this story.
How much of Continental Reckoning explores the role of women and how they helped settle the West?
We'll start with one point. Compared to the East, the American West in these early years was heavily male. I call it the testosterone West. It was a country in many Eastern states. The majority of the population, of adult population, was female. Just the opposite in the West. Across the West, with the exception of Utah and Mormon country in Utah, across the West, the adult male the adult population now. The male population was in a substantial majority, in contrast to the female. In some states, this was territories. It was really quite remarkable. In 5 American Western states and territories, 5 states, for every 10 men, there were only 5 women. In other words, in 5 of these states, in the adult population, men outnumbered women 2 to 1. That said, women in the West played absolutely vital roles in a variety of ways, economic development, for instance. Think about it now. Let's say a family, a family in Pennsylvania or Ohio or Indiana moves out to the West, out to Kansas or Nebraska or California, starts a farm. It's easily a year, often 2 years, before that farm makes a dime. They have to clear the land, plow it, to plant it, you have to fence it, you have to harrow it, and then finally harvest the crops. Well, what are they supposed to use for income during that period? It was women's work. It was the women, the wives and the mothers. Butter and egg money. They would sell butter and eggs at local towns. It was the women who developed gardens that would feed the family during those years. So it's kind of a hidden part of the history of the West that we often miss. And in places like mining towns, where the ratio of men to women was truly bizarre, sometimes as much as 9-1. There was huge demand for women's work, for women to provide for single men what had in their earlier lives had been done by wives and mothers and sisters, boarding these men, cooking for them, washing for them. all of that daily work was part of this as well. Women played crucial roles in the early sort of cultural development of the West in towns like mining towns. They were the school teachers. They were the ones who were most active, often most active in things like churches and other cultural developments. So in all these ways, women played a vital role in the social life, in the development of Western societies. I think probably because they were in a minority, they also had certain legal advantages compared to the East. Much easier to get a divorce in the West, in these early states and territories. The rate of divorce in the West was twice that in the Northeast. It was 3 times that in the Southeast. In Western states and territories, women had greater protection for their economic interest in marriage, protection for the money, for the resources they brought into the marriage, the legal ability to make contracts on their own, which was often denied in Eastern states. So I guess the point is, in homesteading, the homestead law was gender neutral. It was possible for single women to take up land under the Homestead Act, and a lot of them did. By one study, 1 out of every 10 homesteads taken up on the Great Plains, the Northern Great Plains, was taken up by a single woman, an unmarried or a widowed woman. So I guess it's kind of paradoxical, but the very fact that in the West women were a minority made the women even more important in many ways than they were in more settled societies to the East.
Well, folklore in Hollywood movies seem to suggest that the West was settled by stubborn, hardworking pioneers and homesteaders. Does your research corroborate this perception of history?
Well, yeah. I mean, Westerners, Western folks who came out to settle there did work very hard. This was a huge job of work to settle that land, to develop it. They were persistent. They were self-reliant. They were independent. They were, So in that sense, reality does match this romanticized image, this often romanticized image that we have. The tens of thousands of families who went out there were much like families today. They were thinking about simply finding a better way of life, opportunities to build a better life, to pass on to their children and to their grandchildren. That way, this is a kind of a universal story. And this is another way in which Western history reflected this new emerging modern America at that time. The West, in contrast to this romanticized version that we all grow up with, was increasingly dominated by big business, by corporate business, by great pools of capital during these years. And that's something I think we often miss. We think of the rise of big business during these years in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the rise of corporations. We think of the East. We think of iron and steel. We think of petroleum. We think of the great corporate kingpins of the East. Well, if you look in the West, ranching, for example, we think of sort of lonesome cowboys out there on the range. Ranching in the Great Plains was one of the most heavily corporatized businesses in the nation. In just 4 states and territories, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico, there were nearly 500 corporate ranches that were funded by stock and bonds sold across the world. The largest ranch in Wyoming, the Swan Landing Cattle Company, was owned and directed by Scott investors. The largest ranch in the 48 states, XIT in Texas, was owned by Chicago businessmen, a corporation run by Chicago businessmen. Same could be said about mining. Our image of mining we associate with crusty sourdoughs down there by the creek with mining tents. Mining was this heavily corporatized enterprise, sold with a stock that was marketed and sold across the world. Ranching, I'm sorry, farming in many ways was in big business, what we call bonanza farms. These gigantic farms of thousands of acres that were being farmed by newly mechanized machinery developed in industrial America, that were farmed by gang labor that was imported from elsewhere. Big business. So the American West was one of very difficult, hard work done by ordinary families, but it was also an economy that was that again reflected the modern America in its control by big business and by big capital.
What's one aspect of the history of the American West that you find most people don't know or don't fully appreciate?
Oh gosh, there are several examples. The one that really I came to appreciate was science. You can read a lot of Western history, book after book after book in Western history, without the slightest inkling, the slightest clue that during these years, the American West was arguably the most active and productive laboratory of modern science in the world. And this is true of field after field after field, in the physical and the social sciences. Geology, which in many ways was sort of the prince of the sciences during these years. Huge breakthroughs in understanding geology, and both historical and structural geology, how the earth works. New fields like anthropology, which was a field that really just emerging during these same years. Meteorology, oceanography, all of these, one ology after another. If you look at it, you find on the one hand that during these years again, another coincidence, during these years again, fundamental breakthroughs in modern science were made during these years. And again, so many of these are found in the American West. Two pretty dramatic examples of this. The most, of course, the most argued scientific and moral question of the day was that of evolution. The ideas of Charles Darwin about evolution by natural selection. The two most important developments in confirming Darwin's ideas were made by paleontologists and were made in the American West, on the Great Plains, pulling bones, fossilized bones, making these new discoveries out of the chalk beds of Kansas and Nebraska and Montana. So by 1880, in many ways, Darwin's ideas were increasingly confirmed, and those confirmations were coming out of the American West. The second area, epidemiology. the study of disease, the study of why and how we sicken and die. Uh, what was, I would argue, one of the two most fundamental breakthroughs in understanding disease during these years occurred in the West and occurred for all reasons, out of an attempt to solve a problem with those famous cattle drives, those drives of Texas Longhorns out of the out of Texas up into to be marketed on the Great Plains. They had a problem. A problem arose out of those cattle drives, and in solving that problem, these epidemiologists made this basic breakthrough that led us to understand, and about that to control and to cure certain diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia. So pretty dramatic examples of science, the role, and it's of course one more way in which the emergence of the West reflects the emergence of modern America. Certainly, you can say that one of the traits of modern America is that the United States would emerge as at the forefront of scientific work, scientific investigation, and in some ways, this begins in the West.
Well, we're sort of hopefully emerging from a pandemic. I imagine you were pretty busy during the pandemic writing and editing this book for your publisher. But I see you're sitting in your library. Are there a couple of books that you read during the pandemic that you would like to recommend or really love?
Oh boy, I read a good bit, like everybody else, I think. I spent a lot of time reading fiction, not as much history as I did in the past, but I sort of took a break. Read a good bit of fiction. Gosh, some of my favorites. A book called "Never Let Me Go" by Kazuo Ishiguro, which almost never let me go. I found it a fascinating novel, a wonderful novel, a gothic novel. On a lighter note, I fell in love with the books by Richard Osman, the Thursday Murder Club series. That's delightful, charming books. I'm sure that a lot of people also have read. What else? Did read some. Wonderful book called "The Righteous Mind." The Righteous Mind, which is a sort of a study by Jonathan Haidt, a study of what you might call ethnic cognition. How and why we make ethical decisions, moral decisions that we did. And a lot more, but those are some of the highlights, I think.
Is there anything last nugget you want to leave us with about the book? Or do you have a passage you'd like to read to us?
I can read a passage. Yeah, I think the main thing the point I would make about it is that I found this it took me more than 20 years to research and write this book.
Wow.
I came away believing absolutely that this is a fundamental American story that we all need to understand something about, I think, if we are going to understand who we are and how we have come to be as a nation. I think it's critical to understanding it, and it's a great human story. And that's what I hope people can take away from this, what it was like for folks going through this extraordinary time, remarkable time.
Well, fantastic. Do you have a passage you'd like to read?
Sure. This was the time, as I said before, I researched in researching this book. I've tried to pay attention, especially to the documents that reveal us the human part of this story, individual stories, how people lived when they went through it. This is one that I was particularly fond of, and it also illustrates something else. It's basic to understand what was going on during this time. One more coincidence is that the West was born absolutely at the same coincidence with the greatest revolution in movement in human history. There's the ability of people to move around, to move themselves and to move their things and to move information to the telegraph. Most obviously with the railroad, the application of steam power to maritime travel, new methods of road building and road making. All of that had the effect of essentially of sort of shrinking the world generally. But the effect of this story was that the American West, in contrast to earlier frontiers, the American West was born connected. So people were able to move into and out of and around the American West in ways that were unthinkable, even a generation before that. And that affected these human stories. It tells us something about how the American West was developed, how the various changes that occurred in it, and to how it was transformed. Anyway, here's one of those stories. In April of 1880, a young New Englander, Clarence Mayo, was working on a ranch in northeastern New Mexico, funded by a family friend in search for a future in the opening American West. He was restless. Too many people, he thought. He had heard good things about Wyoming. So on April 17th, he set out by rail to Cheyenne, Wyoming, then west to Rock Springs, where he headed north and east on the stage on the May the 5th. 3 days and 200 miles later, he wrote his parents from Crazy Woman Creek in Wyoming, disappointed again. Too many cattle on the way. Now soured on ranching, he learned that, quote, there are some good things about wheat farming. So it was back through Rock Springs and then by rail to St. Paul, Minnesota. His bankroller had recently bought land in Dakota Territory, west of Fargo, and Mayo wrote next from there, confident of success, not wheat now, but potatoes, by cultivating land as level as a floor and as black and rich as a manure heap. It took him a full 8 days to discover that plains farming had 3 serious drawbacks. It required machinery he could not afford. It was very hard work, and there were lots of mosquitoes. Now it is time to go to Montana, he wrote home. His interest in the cattle business suddenly revived. On July 14th, he headed west. A month of silence followed. On August 15th, he wrote his mother of making it as far as Bismarck before switching course. Word was that Montana was badly overdone. Once again, too many people, too many cattle. And besides, he heard that its winters were awfully rough. So he had turned south, and now he was in the mining town of Saguache at the top of Colorado's San Luis Valley. Are you surprised? He asked his mother. She probably wasn't, nor by his letter of September 9th and its menu of possible career paths. A hardware merchant, a grocer, raising hay, raising sheep, raising oats, raising mules. None, however, seemed to fit. On October the 3rd, he wrote to announce his final decision for his life's calling. He had founded the Saguache, Colorado Brass Band. He would be a professional musician.
That is excellent. Thank you very much, Professor West. The book is Continental
You're quite welcome.
Reckoning, The American
Thank
West
you.
and the Age of Expansion.